She wasn't anyone important, at least, not in the eyes of those around her. To most, she was just the woman who cleaned up after the world's most brilliant performers. But that night, inside the revered Langston Music Hall, surrounded by critics, artists, and elites, she would play one piece. And everything would change. Margaret Lane moved quietly through the vast auditorium, her custodial cart rattling softly behind her as she pushed it across the marble floor. At 59, her joints ached more than they used to, and her hands bore the wear of years spent polishing brass rails and scrubbing away spilled wine from red velvet seats. But none of that bothered her now. Not when the hall was finally empty and still. Up on the stage sat the Steinway Model D, bathed in dim stage lighting like a relic on display. Margaret paused, her eyes drawn to the piano the way a sailor might be drawn to the sea. She glanced over her shoulder and called out softly, "Go on without me, Terry. I'll lock up." The security guard at the back of the auditorium gave a half wave. "You're the boss after dark, Maggie." The heavy doors clicked shut. Margaret exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. This was her time. When the spotlights were off, when the critics had gone home, when no one watched or whispered or pointed. When the music was hers. She moved methodically, finishing her rounds, wiping down the railings, checking the backstage lights, sweeping up bits of fallen programs. Then, after one last look around, she climbed the stage steps and walked toward the Steinway. Her heart thrummed in her chest like the low hum of strings preparing to sing. She sat gently on the bench and let her fingers hover above the keys, closing her eyes. She didn't need sheet music. Margaret's hands began to move. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata flowed from her fingertips with a delicate intensity. She played by ear, by memory, by the feeling that had never left her since she was a child. She had once been brilliant, at least. That's what her music teacher had said when she was only 10. But when her father lost his job and the piano had to be sold, lessons ended. Life moved on. Marriage, children, a job that paid the bills. Music became a ghost that only visited when the world wasn't watching. She transitioned seamlessly into Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, her soul pouring into each note, unaware that the back door had opened again. Miles Kendrick, assistant director of Langston Hall, stood frozen just inside the door. He had returned for a forgotten tablet. What he found instead was his janitor playing Chopin with the grace of someone who had no business ever being behind a mop. As the final note faded into silence, Miles finally stepped forward. That was breathtaking. Startled, Margaret nearly toppled off the bench. "I missed her. Kendrick, I didn't mean, I know I'm not supposed to." "Relax, please," he said, raising both hands. "I'm not upset. Just how long have you been playing like this?" Her cheeks flushed, just a little here and there. "After hours. I've always played. Never had formal training, though." Miles walked closer. "Did you know we're holding auditions this week? Our pianist retired. We're looking for a new soloist." She shook her head, almost laughing. "Mr. Kendrick, I clean floors. You're talking about a position for professionals." "I'm talking about a position for someone who can make music speak," he replied, voice firm. "And you, MS. Lane, have that gift." She tried to brush him off with a self-deprecating smile, but he stepped up onto the stage and placed a folded piece of paper beside the music stand. "The first round is this Friday. Preliminary auditions are blind. Behind a screen. No one will know who you are, just what you can do." When he left, Margaret sat staring at the application form for a long time. The next day, she could barely focus. As she buffed the brass on the mezzanine stairs, she heard co-workers talking about the auditions. Names of candidates flew around: Juilliard grads, foreign conservatory prodigies, YouTube famous musicians. All polished, all pedigreed. And then there was her, a self-taught woman with no degree, no resume, and no confidence. She sat in the break room during lunch, chewing quietly as a TV segment aired about the upcoming auditions. The anchor beamed. Langston Hall is expected to choose one of the brightest young pianists in the world for its new soloist. The legendary critic Felix Braham will be judging. Felix Braham. Even Margaret knew that name. His columns could make or break a career with one snide comment. On screen, he spoke in clipped tones, immaculate in a charcoal suit. "We're seeking excellence," he said, "and excellence requires training, structure, technique. That's what separates hobbyists from professionals." Margaret's stomach twisted. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the application. Her name sat at the top in shaky print. She hadn't filled out the rest. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered, and yet she still didn't throw it away. On her day off, Margaret pulled out the old keyboard she'd bought from a thrift store years ago. It didn't have weighted keys. The sustain pedal was missing. But she closed her eyes and played anyway Beethoven's Appassionata, a piece she had loved since she first heard it as a girl. The chaos, the fire, the tenderness, it was life. It was her life. She thought of her children, now grown. Of all the nights she'd cleaned up after others' applause. Of all the times she'd nearly forgotten what her hands were capable of. Friday morning came like a punch to the chest. But she got up. She wore her church dress and brought the form. The staff barely noticed her as she handed it over. She wasn't what they were looking for, but no one stopped her either. That afternoon, she waited behind the curtain. Dozens of young pianists came and went. Margaret could hear snippets of Liszt, Rachmaninoff, Schumann, all technically pristine. Finally, her name was called. Behind the curtain, no one could see her hands trembling. She sat, took a breath, and began. The Appassionata erupted from her fingers with stormy resolve. It wasn't flawless. Her timing wavered once. Her wrist cramped midway. But the emotion was there, the fury, the sorrow, the fight. The part of music that wasn't taught but lived. She didn't expect anything. But when the final note rang out, a calm voice said, "Proceed to the final round." The next morning, Margaret was shaking as she got dressed. The final round would be different. No curtain, no anonymity, just her and Felix Braham, seated front and center. She wore the same cream-colored dress and pinned her graying hair with the care of a woman preparing for church. She entered through the front doors for the first time in her life. Backstage, young contestants whispered and laughed. One girl asked if she was a stage assistant. Margaret simply smiled. Then her name was called. She stepped out into the light. There was a murmur in the audience. Felix glanced at the program. "Ms. Lane," he said, brows raised. "You'll be playing Beethoven?" "Yes, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your background?" "I'm self-taught. I work here. Evening custodian." He didn't hide his surprise. "I see." The whispers grew louder. Felix glanced at his watch. "Very well. Let's hear it." She sat. They weren't watching. They were waiting for her to fail. And maybe she would. But her fingers touched the keys anyway. The room fell silent as the first chords surged across the hall. Felix froze. He knew this interpretation. He'd heard it behind the screen. But this woman? She wasn't supposed to be capable of this. She played with abandon, with pain, with joy. She didn't follow tradition, she followed feeling. And it showed. Orchestra members sat straighter. A cellist put down her phone. A violinist stopped whispering. The music had them now. By the time she finished, the silence was complete. And then applause. It started slow, then more, then all at once. Everyone stood, except Felix. Margaret looked up, dazed. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She could only hear the echo of her father's voice, whispering, "Tell them a secret, Claire Bear." Finally, Felix stood. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Lane, you played with imperfections and honesty. You lack formal polish, but you possess something far more rare." He paused. "You reminded me why music exists in the first place. For that, I thank you." The crowd erupted again. Margaret Lane, custodian of Langston Hall, had arrived. In the weeks that followed, her story went viral. The janitor turned pianist. The hidden genius discovered in plain sight. Felix Braham, who rarely praised anyone, wrote a rare, glowing review. In a world obsessed with technical mastery, Margaret Lane reminded us that music is heart before it is science. She did not graduate from conservatory. She graduated from life. Margaret's first performance as the Langston Symphony's soloist brought a full house. Her children were in the front row. So were the custodial staff. So was Felix. As the lights dimmed and she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to its feet before she played a single note. When she sat at the piano, she paused. Then, with a breath, her fingers touched the keys and the world listened.